Welcome to the Master Founder interview with Jay Haley. My name is Bill Doherty and I'll be conducting the interview. The goal of these interviews is to give current and future generations of family therapists the opportunity to hear the stories of the people who founded our field or gave it a major new direction. The interview will be taped for posterity and made available to training programs for a long time to come. I will be focusing on the questions about the inside story of Jay Haley's career and his contributions, as opposed to material already covered well in writings or in teaching tapes. Jay has asked that the interview deal with his professional life and respect the privacy of his personal life, and I'm happy to do so. At the end, there will be time for questions from the audience. Please line up at the microphones and ask brief, focused questions. There will be monitors at the microphones, the two microphones, to help you go in sequence. So if you're lined up there and you're said go, then you go. Now please join me in welcoming one of the creative pioneers of family therapy, Jay Haley. Well, here we are.
Okay.
I looked at your resume and realized that you started out as a reference librarian.
Well, that happened along the way. That's
okay. Well, was that what you were doing?
You know, I was just thinking about something that had an effect of something in my personal life that had an effect on my interest in families. I was born in the middle of an argument. The doctor was late, and my father delivered me, and my mother told him he wasn't doing it right. That's absolutely true. But anyhow, go ahead.
So there was the triangle right away, right?
I was a reference librarian as a way to make a living. I was going to be a great writer, and I started going to graduate school, and I needed to work my way through. So I took a quick degree as a librarian. Then I worked at Stanford in the libraries while I went through my degree at Stanford.
Okay. What kind of writing did you want to do?
I was going to be a playwright. I took a playwriting course at UCLA and thought I was on my way.
No one else did? Is that the problem?
No one else thought so.
Yeah.
What made me do it is, I went to UCLA as a pre-law major, and I started going to the theater to meet girls, really, at the theater department, with a friend of mine, and we began to get into the theater, and I got interested in playwriting. And then I sold a little story to the New Yorker at that time, and the New Yorker was really something.
Yes.
So I thought, this is it, and I was on my way. It was 5 years before I sold another story, I think. So,
do you remember the name of the story?
No, I don't. Too long ago.
It's not in your resume. I thought you were going to tell me everything in this resume.
It should be in there.
It should be in there. Yeah. Yeah. Well, some student will watch this tape someday and go to back issues of the New Yorker and pull it out.
No, I'm sure.
Maybe that'll happen. How did you meet Gregory Bateson, and how did you get started with him?
Well, my last year at UCLA, a social psychologist posed the question, why do people go to the movies? And I thought, that's a curious question, and I began to get interested in it. At that time, there were 5 million people who saw every movie released, and there'd be 50 million go to one. And after TV developed, people spent hours. There must be some tremendous appeal. So I wanted to investigate that, and I went to Stanford. I was getting my degree in communications. And Bateson was one of the few people who ever analyzed a movie. So I called him. He was over at the VA hospital, and he invited me over. And he showed me a film of his, Hitler Jungerquecks. It was a German propaganda film. And we got in an argument about it. And he hired me on his project. It was, I was very Freudian in those days. I'd done a lot of reading in that literature because I was dealing with a Freudian metaphor for analyzing films. And there was a young man in this film with a knife that was very significant. And I thought Bateson didn't understand the proper, or have the respect for the castration that fears that he should have.
Plain as day, right?
That's right. So we had an argument, and he was just beginning a project. And he brought me on to it, and he brought John Weekland, who was studying Chinese films. So we were all studying films.
That's not something that I knew that Bateson had been interested in before.
Oh, yeah. There was a project he was involved in called Culture at a Distance, which was studying countries you couldn't get into, like Russia, by studying their films. Russia, China, and so on. It was a big project.
What year was this that you
53.
And Weekland joined about the same time?
Same time, yeah.
And then, so what did you do with him? He hired you to do what?
Well, it wasn't too clear. I'd spent time trying to find out. We began to, I was his technical assistant, really, or almost a secretary of the project. Then he graduated me. When I had to go to Mexico to give a paper that he couldn't go because of immigration reasons, he raised me up to research associate, I think. But anyhow, we were studying different kinds. The project was to study the paradoxes of communication, of classification in communication. So we were looking for paradoxes. And we examined films. We examined a lot of animal behavior because Bateson was interested in that. And actually, it was a project on communication, and everything's communication, so you can study.
So it was a project on everything.
That's right.
What did you learn most during those days before you were studying families? I mean, what were the core threads that you carried on later?
Well, in 1953, I met Bateson and went to work with him. I met Milton Erickson that year. I took a seminar on hypnosis from him because we were studying hypnosis communication.
Okay, say more about that.
And
you
I
just
met
decided,
Alan Watts.
And Alan Watts. Starting with Erickson, what was the connection? Was he in town? Or did you go to see him? Or how did you?
He was, you weren't allowed to study hypnosis in those days. At least psychiatrists weren't. So it wasn't regular programs. It was done in a traveling seminar, and Erickson would come in for a weekend seminar. And I told Bateson I wanted to take that, and he called Eric. He knew everybody. He called him and arranged it, and I went up and took the seminar.
Why were you interested in hypnosis?
Well, it was an interesting form of communication, is what I was thinking. That it was worth investigating. I don't know where the interest came from. But I just knew that that teacher was coming to teach us, so I wanted to go learn it.
Did you make an immediate connection with him there?
Oh, yeah.
That you followed up on?
I got very impressed with him. And we then, as our project, got interested in studying hypnosis. John Weekland and I started to go down to Arizona to see Erickson. To get, he was the hypnotist of the country at that time. And we wanted the best information we could get on hypnosis.
And still as
so I started, for 17 years, I went down to visit him around hypnosis and therapy and so on. But that started that year. Yeah.
And then Alan Watt?
Yeah, Alan Watts was the authority on Zen. And I took a course from him, because Zen's a form of communication, right? It was a course on Eastern philosophy and Western psychiatry, and it was extraordinarily interesting. And at that time, we were beginning to study therapy. And there was no therapy except psychodynamic therapy. There was no other ideology, really. It was before behavior therapy, before systems theory. And I got interested in Zen as an ideology, if you could have one in Zen, for therapy. And I began to realize that I could make sense out of Erickson's therapy with the Zen framework, where it didn't make any sense at all with a psychodynamic framework. So I got into it more and more.
How did you make the shift from the day you walked into Bateson's office with a psychoanalytic set of images to a few years later you were looking at Zen?
The same year.
Same year, okay.
Yeah.
You're quicker than I thought. Yeah, what happened?
It's hard to remember I think part of the problem was I was very impressed with psychodynamic theory as an explanation of people. And I didn't think much of it as a therapy. It didn't seem to be changing anybody. And the data was beginning to come out on that. So we began to look at therapy and began to try to find some other therapy besides psychodynamic therapy, and the only one we found was Erickson. So when we looked at him, I got very interested in that and just sort of dropped the psychodynamic ideology. Really.
How did you make the transition from focus on communication to therapy?
Well, we studied therapy as a form of communication.
Communication. Maybe we should write down what you did not study. It might be simpler, yeah.
It was a busy project. Well, John Weekland and I were trying to figure out what Bateson was talking about in this study of paradoxes of communication.
Right.
And after a while, we just sort of gave it up and decided to study what interested us, and that's what we did in the project.
Because you were never going to understand Bateson?
Right.
Yeah. Well, he was reading Principia Mathematica, Whitehead and Russell.
That was the basic text of the project.
Yeah. A 50-year-old book about higher mathematics and logical levels. Did you ever read it?
Oh, I read the preface, certainly. But there was a real contribution in that. Russell and Whitehead were talking about classification systems, and that in the nature of classification, paradox gets generated. Bateson took that idea and said that in communication, there's a classification system, and in communication, inevitably paradox gets generated. And that's what he was interested in. And we started with the Greek paradoxes. Epimenides' statement that if a person says, I am lying, is he telling the truth? Because if he's lying, he's telling the truth. And that kind of a problem was what interested Bateson. And we looked at it in a variety of areas.
And then he gave you the freedom to explore things you were interested in.
That's right. And actually, it was the first time I really understood a paradox was in hypnosis, where a therapist or a hypnotist is directing a person to spontaneously respond. It's a paradoxical procedure.
And you saw it then? I mean, you saw your first paradox?
That's right. Actually, the first double bind, which is what came out of that project. The project started in 52 or 3 with a 2-year grant. And at the end of 2 years, we tried to get a renewal to go on studying paradoxes. And, well, you know, it's interesting how somebody's personal life gets involved in their therapy, in their research. Well, I tend to think of therapy as a research project. Yes, it still is to me.
It wasn't a slip at all, was it? No.
But anyhow, Bateson got a grant he went to, I've forgotten the name of the foundation now, but it was a foundation. He wanted to get this grant to study these paradoxes in communication, and he happened to hit a foundation that had as the head of it a man who'd been a head of Bell Telephone and understood what he was talking about, and gave him the 2-year grant. So Bateson brought John and I in. We studied for 2 years all these phenomena, but at the end of 2 years we didn't have much, really. We'd published one paper that I gave in Mexico, and that was it. So we were looking around for a topic that might be more remunerative than paradox. But anyhow, what Bateson did is he went back to ask for a renewal, and the man he would give it to him was no longer there. It was just a committee who didn't know what he was talking about.
Which was not surprising, since you had trouble yourself, right?
So he went back expecting to be turned down, and he was turned down. And he came back and he wrote a letter to Norbert Wiener, the cybernetician, saying that he had an explanation of schizophrenia. The schizophrenics were caused by being punished for expecting punishment. And I know that came out of that expectation of going back there to be turned down. And he was turned down. And it was a punishing experience.
Yeah.
And we were beginning to look at schizophrenics at that time.
And there it was.
And there it was.
It's all because that guy from Bell wasn't there anymore.
That's right.
Yeah.
And he got a grant from another foundation for 2 more years to study schizophrenia. And John and I talked to him about this double bind, which he created the term of, and said, how do you know a schizophrenic was punished for expecting punishment? Bateson said it happened. And we said, well, we really don't have any data to show this happened. He said it happened. It has to happen. Or a schizophrenic wouldn't communicate in the way he does. And so John and I went up to the mountains with Gregory. And we took a cabin. And we spent 2 days trying to find out what he meant by the double bind. And after a day and a half, he said, that's the sort of thing that must have happened. And then we read the sort of thing. So then we began to find that sort of thing happening in various situations. And we started a project on schizophrenia. But that's where the double bind idea came from, really. It was out of that.
The expecting punishment.
That's right.
And
he argued that parents punish a kid, and when they come near him again, the kid cringes. And then the parents are indignant that he's expecting punishment, so they punish him again. So he's punished for expecting punishment. It was
that was the first insight.
That's right.
Okay. Okay.
And Bateson just pulled that out of the air, really.
And was sure it was right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, he reasoned deductively from general principles.
That's right. From the confusion in a schizophrenic's communication, he must have been raised in a learning situation where that kind of confusion is appropriate, was Erickson. I mean, Bateson's argument.
You mentioned Norbert Wiener as another character here around this time. So tell how you got connected with him.
Well, Norbert Wiener was the man who coined the word cybernetics and formulated it, really, the systems theory. And he was a friend of Bateson's, of course. I met him when he came out to visit. One of the interesting things to me was that when Bateson explained this idea of the double bind of Wiener, Wiener got it immediately. He said, that makes perfect sense. So I figured I just wasn't up to Wiener's caliber here.
Yeah, these guys are in a higher level, obviously. Yeah. And so did he come back? Or was it...
Well, a funny thing happened. He came back I might have been the next time. And we were all ready to have profound theoretical discussions with Wiener. And we met at Bateson's house. And John Weakland had a Chinese wife. And Wiener was learning Chinese. And that shot the whole evening. You know. He would only talk Chinese that whole evening. So we didn't have our profound theoretical discussion.
It may have been profound, but in Chinese. You know,
That's right.
Don't know. Yeah.
Yeah.
So he had known Bateson, I guess, since the Second World War.
No, in the end of the 40s, there were the cybernetic conferences where systems theory was produced in a way and disseminated widely through all the fields. And Bateson was in those conferences. Milton Erickson was in the first conference as the authority on hypnosis. And Wiener was in there, and that's where they met.
Okay. Now, was Bateson talking about systems theory, or when in 53 and 54, or more communication?
He was.
He was, okay.
He had started in the 30s dealing with armaments races as an escalation. He wrote his book Novin in 36, which was about, it was very advanced for anthropology of that time. It was a tribe where the clans escalated and in like an armaments race, and then they had a ceremony that brought them down so they could start over again. And he was trying to describe that as an escalation and then a starting over in a systems way. He didn't have the language for it. And when Wiener came along with cybernetics, then it made sense to Bateson. So he began to apply it and introduce it into psychiatry.
And was Bateson introducing these ideas to you then when he hired you on and you were exposed to these other...
Well, we worked with him 40 hours a week for 10 years. I mean, I don't think there's ever been a research project that lasted that long or was that full of time. I mean, it was more than 40 hours a week often when we got off into all kinds of things.
How did you study schizophrenia? What were the methods that you used?
We started talking to schizophrenics and recording them. We did a survey trying to investigate the circumstances of a psychotic episode. What happened to drive them out of their minds? And then we began to do therapy with him. And we did it like it was done in those days. It was 5 hours a week. Every day you had your hour session. So we had a couple of those each. And that's when Don Jackson came on the project as a consultant to supervise us with schizophrenics.
Okay, what year was this?
This must have been 54, 55.
Okay, so you were doing your research by doing therapy, in a sense.
Well, we didn't start doing therapy. We just started talking to them. But it's hard to talk to a schizophrenic without getting into a therapeutic mode, really.
So then you said, we need some help?
Yeah, and Jackson was one of the few people who was an expert on schizophrenia as a therapist. There were a dozen experts on doing therapy with schizophrenics. And Curie, he was a marvelous clinician, really, and he was beginning to work with their families. He'd been supervised personally by Sullivan, and most family therapists have had some contact with Sullivan. So, you know, years ago when I was with GAP, the Group for Advancement of Psychiatry, we did a survey of about 300 family therapists at that time, and almost all of them had some connection with Sullivan. It's interesting that, what an influence he had, even though he himself wouldn't see families. He couldn't stand women. So it was awkward for him to talk to a mother, apparently. But that's what I've heard, anyhow.
So he brought Sullivan in, and Sullivan came in through Jackson.
That's right.
So you had these, you had the cybernetics, you had anthropology coming in, you had communication and film, you had all of these, you had Zen religion, all of these,
That's right.
all of
And
these, and hypnosis,
right.
all of these coming together. It must have been a very exciting time.
It was a very exciting time. It was, there was an interesting thing about Sullivan and therapy, too. If you're dealing with a patient and you're supervised by a Sullivanian, the patient does something, you're asked, what did you do when he did that? Like if a patient starts to ask to be delusional, a Sullivanian question is, what were you saying at that time that the guy responded in that way? It seems kind of obvious that he might be responding to you, but that was a revolutionary idea at that time. The Freudian position was these are just disordered thoughts in the head. They aren't a response to the therapist at all. It was just a projection, really. And Jackson, when supervising me with a schizophrenic, I had to always deal with the question, what was I doing when the patient began to act this way? And it built in an interpersonal concern that fitted in with cybernetics in a way, that there was a systematic behavior as therapist and patient went after each other. It was a time that was very exciting, really. You know, on that project, we started in 53, and by 56, when we published the double-bind paper, we'd published one other paper.
Really?
That's all. Between 56 and 62, we published 70 publications, including a book or two. So the ideas just began to come out of there.
They were germinating between
right, for
53 and
2-3 years,
56. How do you look back on the double-bind paper now?
Well, I think it was an interesting paper. And it had a tremendous influence. I mean, people, we got so many reprint requests and so many people it touched a chord in people in some way, that paper. But you notice if you read the paper that we didn't really have any family data. That paper was, I happen to know the dates because I read a history. We wrote that, we finished writing it in June and hit a new journal. It was just being born. So it was published in September instead of waiting a couple of years to get it published. So when it was published in September, we still hadn't seen a family. Later in the fall of 56, I began to see a family. Only not as family therapy. I had a patient, one of the guys we were seeing individually, who had a problem with his parents. That when they'd visit him in the hospital, he'd faint. And he'd collapse on the hospital ground. This was at the VA hospital. And then his parents would go off to the ward and get an aide and come back. The aide would say, get up, and he'd get up and go back to the ward. And he couldn't stay with his parents more than 5 minutes without fainting. And I'm busy doing therapy with him. Had the problem that he didn't think he could leave the hospital without going to his family, back home to his parents. And I was trying to help him get out of the hospital. But I figured he isn't going to make it if he can't be with his parents more than 5 minutes. So I brought his parents in with him for a session. And he stood up against the wall like he was scared to death. And I had a session in which he managed to get through the hour. So I asked him to come back again. We had another session. And that was when we began to take the recordings of that and realize the possibility that we weren't talking about an ideological theory of expecting punishment and so on, that this could be currently caused. And that was a tremendous step for us. It was also an education to realize what they actually did in that family. I mean, not what the parents did. This young man did something that I thought was extraordinary. He sent his mother a Mother's Day card which said, "You've always been like a mother to me." It's true.
A contemporary therapist could hardly have come up with a better prescription for him.
Right.
Yeah.
And she brought that letter into the session. She said, "There's something wrong with this card." And she couldn't clarify what it was that was wrong with it.
Well, she hadn't studied Bateson for many years.
So anyhow, I began to see that family. That was the fall of '56. By '57, I had a family, and we were officially doing, in the spring, we were officially doing family therapy. But at the time I saw this family, we didn't think of it as that. We just thought of seeing the parents because of this guy's fear of them, really.
And the double bind paper came out before you began to see families.
I think so, yeah. I think it came out in June, and we saw them in the fall.
The descriptions, the anecdotes in the paper were about observations on the unit or another, or stories through an individual, rather than based on observations.
There was one of Jackson's of a mother and son on a bench that he'd observed, but they weren't out of family sessions. But once we started seeing families, we began to realize, you know what impresses me is Bateson had no problem shifting from an ideological explanation to an idea that this is a currently caused malady. And that was an age where everybody explained the present by the past. Any kind of a problem was caused by a past problem. So it was very hard to get out of that. And Bateson got right out of it with us, really. John and I managed to get out of it, too.
Well, it's consistent with his focus on those escalating loops. And
on being an anthropologist,
right.
On current
And
behavior.
it may have been because none of the first group, of course Jackson was a psychiatrist, but the others of you were not mental health professionals.
That's right.
And you were not tied as strongly, perhaps, to those ideological assumptions.
That's right. We were outsiders, absolutely, We happened to be housed in the VA hospital because Bateson was employed there. But we weren't part of the structure there at all, really.
If Bateson had been employed somewhere else other than the VA hospital, you might be known as one of the great film critics of our time.
That's possible,
yeah. So the paper had a big impact. And did you get more funding because of that?
No.
No?
We got another 2 years somewhere along there. We lived on 2 years. It was not much tenure on it, but it was a project where you could do anything you wanted, so it was worth not having the tenure in a way.
Well, you began to do some more systematic kind of research, didn't you, observing families?
Oh, we did a lot of observing therapists and recording therapists. We studied John Rosen in '54. That was quite early, really. There was a meeting in Sea Island, Georgia, of the people who were doing therapy with schizophrenics, and Bateson went to it, got interested in Rosen. John Rosen was a man who specialized in psychotics. And Bateson brought John and I to Pennsylvania to visit Rosen on the way back from that meeting. And the way he treated patients is he rented the homes of the rich, and he'd put a patient in a home with a young couple in charge. And they would treat him 24 hours a day, and Rosen would make his rounds and do his visiting. And he had his own style of therapy. He also had an interesting way of going around to state hospitals and asking to interview patients before the staff to show that they're human. and that you can have a conversation with him. And this upset a lot of people when he did that. And we got, the way we heard about him originally, we had a mimeographed interview that he had done in a state hospital. We got interested in that. But anyhow, we studied John Rosen, we studied a variety of analysts, we studied whoever we could get because we were beginning to get interested in what is therapy, both with schizophrenics and otherwise.
At some point, there began to be some divergence of interests on the team between those interested in intervention and those interested in more pure description. Is that accurate?
I don't think so.
No?
Bateson never wanted to do a manipulative therapy himself. I mean, I should straighten this out about power and Bateson and me, because the suggestion is that he and I had something about power. We worked together 10 years, must have had 50,000 conversations about therapy, and power was never an issue. And the two most extreme power people in the field were John Rosen, who would force a patient on his knees in front of him, and Erickson, who would manipulate patients in very complex ways and was comfortable with the idea of power. And those were the two men that Bateson had us study as therapists. So he was certainly interested, and he wasn't against the way they worked. I've got an interview of John Rosen. There was a patient who said he was God. And we arrived at this house with Rosen and 3 or 4 great big guys, and the young couple and the little patient, about 5 foot tall, was there, and the guy had this idea he was God. So Rosen said, I've forgotten how he started. I've got this on audio tape somewhere. He started the conversation by saying something that, the guy's mother has to do what he says. The guy says, no, you have to do what my mother says. Rosen said, don't you know who God is? And the guy said, I'm God. Rosen said, no, I'm God. And the guy said, no, I'm God. And Rosen said, show them who's God, boys. And these big burly guys put this little guy down on his knees in front of Rosen. So Rosen said, now who's God? The guy said, I'm God. And Rosen said, why don't you get up then? And the guy said, oh, tell him to get away. So Rosen says, all right, everybody get away. And the guy stood up and said, oh, I should have obliterated him. And everybody in that room was laughing, including the patient. And in the background, you can hear Bateson roaring with laughter over the seat. I mean, it sounds kind of grim, but it was a funny scene. And that's the way Rosen worked.
The patient was God, after all.
But one of the things that happened is Rosen said, come back next year, you'll find him sitting out on the front porch reading a book. Bateson went back, and there, by God, he was as normal as can be, sitting out reading a book.
In 1958, you published an article on the art of psychoanalysis,
right.
And you published some material on control and power as core. Was that the year when you individually, you think, when your voice began to be heard most as an individual? Heard in the sense of publications and to the wider community?
Oh, I think so. I started publishing in '57. I started doing a series of papers which later were collected into strategies of psychotherapy, but those started about '57. One of the things about that art of psychoanalysis is that also touched a chord. I got about 2,000 reprint requests for that, and I finally put it in a book where it didn't belong to stop the reprint requests. But there's an interesting thing about that. I'm curious when you look back. I was writing this, and it's a spoof of psychoanalysis. And I said to Jack, I showed it to Jackson, he thought it was funny, and I said, do you think I should publish this, or do you think the people in analysis will get upset by this, and perhaps I shouldn't publish it? Jackson said, any competent analyst can handle it if they do get upset, and why protect incompetent ones? And I thought that was such a sensible statement, and I published it.
And your image of families' interaction as being organized around issues of control. Say where that emerged from and how you began to crystallize that as such a core.
Well, it didn't come around families. It came around hypnosis, I think.
Okay.
That obviously hypnosis deals with control and influence and power in various ways. And I was studying Erickson. I started a private practice in '56, the year of the double mind paper. And I wanted to do I had been teaching courses in hypnosis after learning from Erickson to the local therapist. And I went into practice, really Don Jackson set me up because there were a lot of people with symptoms that medical doctors didn't like to refer to psychiatrists because it meant long-term treatment. And there was no brief therapy. So a hypnotist could do a brief therapy, so I did it. And I started doing it and realized I didn't know what I was doing. So I started going to Erickson to consult because he was the only one I knew who was doing any brief therapy, really. Mm-hmm. And in that, I got more and more involved in his way of thinking about therapy and his work.
Mm-hmm. And so it was the therapeutic relationship in hypnosis that gave you the focus on the issues of control and power that you carried then over to the broader psychotherapy and to looking at family
I began
dynamics.
to think that way, yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I remember what I thought was a great discovery was that that you had two levels. You have a level of being in charge, and you have a level of deciding who's in charge. Mm-hmm. And that distinction became important to me in thinking through. That is, you can take authority by giving it to other people. Well, let me put it, there's an anecdote that I remember Erickson and I were talking about power once, and who was in charge when hypnotizing. And he said he'd been hypnotizing a group of people previously, and he woke them all, each one of them, he woke up by saying, you'll wake up refreshed and relaxed and so on. And when he finished, one of the subjects came up to him and said, you didn't wake me properly like the others. You didn't say, I'll wake up relaxed and refreshed. So Erickson put her back in a trance and said, you wake up relaxed and refreshed. And he said, now she was in charge because she made me do that. But what she didn't know was that I hadn't done that purposely. Mm-hmm. So that she would come up and ask me to do that. Mm-hmm. And that's how complex who was in charge was with Erickson. Mm-hmm. And that got me interested in those processes.
Mm-hmm. Before the master interview with Salvador Minuchin, he said, I will let you lead me in this interview. So is that an example of what you're talking about?
He will permit you to lead.
Yes,
right? Okay.
yes, yes. And then I did a great job leading, so it's who's in charge.
It's like that, yeah.
Right, right. Well, I want to get back to the Bateson issue around power and control, because at least the folklore in the family therapy field is that Bateson was very skittish about therapy because it dealt with intervention and power and control, and that he viewed himself more as an anthropologist studying what was there. Is there something to that?
Well, he didn't like a therapy that was manipulative, even though he liked to study it, and he didn't object to other people doing it. He just didn't want to do it. By manipulative, I mean to indirectly get somebody to do something outside their awareness was something that a lot of people still object to. Well, let me give you an anecdote. You know, another thing that probably isn't known, the Bateson Project was housed in a building on this VA hospital. And in the same building were Krasner and Ullman, who were beginning to develop behavior therapy, or they were part of that group. And they had they'd made a big step from the idea that you can influence animal behavior by positive reinforcements to the idea that you can influence human behavior by positive reinforcements using yourself. I mean, it sounds like kind of an obvious thing, but I mean, that was a big step. And we used to have these research lunches where we presented ideas to the staff of the VA and so on. And they presented this procedure. And the staff of the VA was a very conservative, analytic crowd. And what they said was that if you want a patient to behave in a certain way, you can reinforce positively that way, and he'll behave more and more that way. And they gave us an example. Suppose you want a patient to express more emotions. Well, what you do is when he's expressing an emotion, you nod and smile, and when he's not expressing an emotion, you don't respond. And by the end of an hour, you'll have a really emotional patient. And so they presented this with some pleasure. You know? And I remember the training director in that hospital said, that is an awful thing to do to anybody. To influence them outside their awareness like that, to get them to behave in a certain way. That's the behavior of a cat, is what he was saying. And I remember one of these guys said, well, you know, you do that anyhow. That when a patient does what you like, you nod and smile, and when he doesn't, you don't respond. And the training director said, if you do it without knowing you're doing it, it's okay. And I think that's the way a lot of people feel. That to deliberately influence somebody outside their awareness is improper. But if you're doing it all the time, and that's okay, you know. Erickson just argued you should know what you're doing. Do it deliberately.
Tell us about how you became the editor of Family Process.
Well, I was trying to get out of practice. I had this full-time job in a private practice on the side, and it was a lot of hours. And it was a brief therapy with a rapid turnover, and I had to come up with directives all the time. And I had to have more referrals than other people in order to keep the hours filled. And so I decided I had about enough of that. I really went into it partly for research purposes. I mean, I wanted to make some money, but I felt investigating therapy, you should do it in order to understand what's happening. So anyhow, I was looking around for a way to get out of that, and I thought of, I was talking with Don Jackson, and I said we ought to start a journal, and that I would do the work of it for nothing if, when it started to make money, I could have some income and I could give my practice up. So he agreed to that. It never did make enough money. But we started it, and he wanted to make it a national one by having another institute. He didn't want just the MRI to do it. So we asked Ackerman if he'd like to be involved. Ackerman said he'd be happy to be involved if he could be editor. And we said that I was going to be the editor, so he couldn't be the editor, and we'd look for another institution. And he said, well, I don't have to be editor, so I'll agree. So he came up with some money, and we came up with some money, and that started the journal, really. And the problem was getting any papers.
Really?
There weren't many writers in the field then, and they wrote awfully because nobody had any language for families. I mean, there wasn't even a good systems theory language developed yet. So we did it semi-annually, and when I put an issue out, I may have one paper for the next issue and hope they'll come in.
Wow. Were you beginning to meet other people, or were you going to meetings and getting connected with the other groups?
To hustle papers for that journal, I started going everywhere, yeah.
I see.
And I would encourage people to write. And Ray Birdwhistle, who never published a paper, because he was always going to wait and do a perfect one. I remember once he gave a talk in Philadelphia, and I went up and took his paper out of his hand. And when he finished it, and I said, I'd like to publish this, and walked away with it and published it. But it was hard to get enough. And it was the way I got around the country, finding out what was going on. Because anybody I heard doing anything with families, I would go visit them to see if I can get a paper out of them.
Well, it's an interesting story that the journal kind of drove the field as much as the field driving the journal then.
Sure.
It was almost premature, the journal, because there wasn't this sort of body of work of writing that needed to be brought together.
Sure.
It was more out ahead.
But you know, there was also a decision, as I remember now, whether to have a journal. Family therapy, we were beginning to realize, was something new. And I'll say a little about what's different about it, but we had the question whether to make a group of family therapists separate from all the other therapists, to go off into a pocket like hypnotists did, for that matter. They made their own group and so on. Or should we infiltrate all the journals with family articles and make family therapy more widespread in the whole field? And we decided finally to make a journal to encourage the writing, really. But it is a question whether it wouldn't have been better to have all the papers in other journals rather than to have a journal of our own and collect the papers.
If they would have accepted them, that would have been the danger.
And they have to be written pretty well to be accepted in legitimate journals.
But not our journals.
Right. Actually, I was married to a woman at the time who did the editing and turned it into English, most of those papers, so that helped.
Yes, yes. How about your move to Philadelphia? What was connected with that?
what happened was I left, when the Bateson project ended in '62, and then I went over to the MRI, which was starting, and I ran a research project for 5 years, testing families. I tested hundreds of families, abnormal, normal, all kinds. And I was trying to get it supported, and I couldn't. And Jackson was getting some money, but I tried to get it so I had something ongoing. And it was a struggle to keep it going. And I was getting interested in, things were happening. This was the '60s. And I was beginning to feel like Palo Alto was a place where you sat and thought about things happening elsewhere. I mean, there wasn't a lot of action in Palo Alto. And then Mnuchin came out and offered me a job. Actually, there was an interesting thing about that. I had visited him at Wiltwyck School because I was visiting everywhere they were doing families. And they had a one-way mirror set up there. Well, there's an interesting difference in the way they were working and the way I was working then. They were just working as he describes it, as a pushing and pulling and getting people to communicate and quiet and so on. And they were working with a woman and her 2 children who had been, one or both was delinquent. And they were persuading her to do something with the boys and take charge of whatever. And I was talking to Braulio Montalvo and Sal about it. And they said, what would you do with this case? And I was thinking like an Ericksonian. So I said, well, the woman has no front tooth. She was a young woman, and she talks with her hand in front of her mouth, so that obviously this is some concern to her. And I said to her, I would tell the boys they should help their mother, and they should help her get a tooth, so that she'd be more attractive. She wants to be more attractive. Could probably be a man in the house then. And that they should take jobs. They can't steal to do this, because you don't steal for your mother. They should get jobs, make some money, and buy her a front tooth. And I remember those guys looked at me like, where did you come from? You know? I mean, they were doing family therapy, you know?
And Sal offered you a job after this, huh?
After that, he did.
Yeah. He must have been intrigued.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, he came out to visit and stayed with me and offered a job. And I got an agreement with him that I'd get paid, and I wouldn't have to do anything I didn't want to do, and I wouldn't have to write grant proposals.
Wow, what a job.
So that lasted maybe 6 months while I was with him, or maybe a year. But I wanted to rethink whatever I was doing, and I came back, and I wanted to work with the poor. I wanted to do a longitudinal study, really. And then I started just fooling around with different kinds of research, and began having young people I would teach them how to use a 60mm camera, and then let them shoot whatever they wanted without influencing it, to see how they see the world. There had been some work with Indians, and Navajo Indians that way. And I had a young man going for his PhD who was working with me on it. And we took adolescent blacks, adolescent whites, working class, upper class, and compared the films they made. And when Sal was talking about this film, that these young women, one group of black girls one of them wrote a script, they shot this film. And that's a powerful film. And they put titles on it, they put music with it. I mean, they did a great job. And they wrote it. I didn't have any, that was the art of staying out of it. All I did was show them how to do the camera. And that's the one that the black militants got up in arms about. And we had the mothers come in who were rather pleased that their daughters made this film with music and titles and all of it. But anyhow, they said that we had to burn the film. And I said we wouldn't burn the film, and went to Sal. So then the militant said, well, we'll burn the clinic. So Sal had to take this pretty seriously, and he absolutely backed it. He said, we will not burn that girl's film. That's their film, they made it. So there was interesting things like that going on, as well as that clinic had a Vietnamese war parade. I mean, out would walk the staff with their banners in the protest marches. And there was a feeling in the clinic of things being done and happening. And
activists.
And doing something for the world, you know, that was very nice then.
You were always interested in research. You got into this field as a researcher, and you did gather quite a lot of research data in California and continue with that. You were one of the people trying to bring together researchers and clinicians. Mm-hmm. How do you look back upon the field's development in terms of whether research and practice have gone together or diverged, and what's happened?
Well, I think they've diverged. There's very little family research around clinical outcome and that sort of thing with families, I think. There was a period where we thought it was going to be easy, that just as you can type individuals, we would be able to type families, that you'd have a family of a delinquent, a family of a schizophrenic, a normal family, a family of psychosomatic problems. And it was just a matter of devising the right tests that would demonstrate this. And we struggled over this, and it didn't come out that easy. Mm-hmm. It turned out to be much more complicated. And it taught me a lot about families. I drew a sample of normal families for contrast. We draw them out of the high schools and test them. And then I would hustle abnormal families with an abnormal member from wherever I could get them. And the normals were what surprised me. Mm-hmm. Because we all thought we knew what normals were, and they weren't that way. Mm-hmm. As an example, we have a test where there's a conflict built into it. There's something mother wants, something the kid wants, something father wants, and they talk about it and reach agreement on what they want. In a family with an abnormal kid, the kid would say he wants something, and the father would say, "Oh, why do you feel you want that?" "I see, tell me more," and he would encourage the kid to talk about what he wants. Usually the kid didn't get it anyhow, but there was such a feeling of talking it over. In the normal families, the kid would say he wanted something, the father would say, "You don't get that. Let's go to the next one." They were rude, is really what the difference was. And that surprised me, that really the more abnormal ones were behaving the way clinicians at that time thought parents ought to behave. As kindly and helpful and tell us more and so on, So things like that happened that surprised me.
Well, you may be one of the few family therapists who has studied normal families.
Studied a big sample, that's
yes,
right.
Yeah.
Many people have taken one normal family and make a big deal of it. Mm-hmm. Just deciding who's normal was a problem.
Yeah.
When we thought first we'd use clinicians. They'd examine the family, decide if they were normal or not. They never found a normal family. So we started taking them randomly. That's true. I mean, they're trained to find psychopathology. Mm-hmm. They're not trained to find normality. Mm-hmm. And what we did was end up with any family where no member had been arrested or been in therapy was a normal family. Mm-hmm. That if they contained the problems within the family, that was a normal family. If they had the community involved, it wasn't. Mm-hmm. It was really what we ended up with. Mm-hmm.
What went into the decision to leave the Philadelphia Child Guidance Clinic and move to D.C. and start your own institute?
Gee, I'd been there 10 years, and that was long enough. I'm not altogether sure. I got tired of the clinic, and the clinic was changing, and I just began to think about, well, there is an interesting thing about it. When I went to the Child Guidance Clinic, I was very Ericksonian in my therapy, really. And I had been using hypnosis, was doing a lot of paradox. And the structure of the therapy training of the clinic, if I had introduced that, it would have put confusion in the way people were being trained there. Mm-hmm. So I backed off and went with a more structural family therapy in order to fit in, because we're training. I got involved in training people there. I was training quite a few. So I also began to think I'd like to have a place of my own in order to begin to do and teach the kind of therapy I would like to do and teach. Mm-hmm. And Chloe Madonis and I got together and talked about it and ended up starting one together here in Washington, mm-hmm. where we could do it in our own way, let's put it that mm-hmm. way. Mm-hmm. She had been an Erickson enthusiast before that.
Mm-hmm. It strikes me that you always were working around other senior people, both at the Bateson team and MRI in Philadelphia with Sal Minuchin, and Chloe, you always must have liked that kind of interaction.
Well, she wasn't very senior when I started. Mm-hmm. She was a supervisor at the clinic in Philadelphia with me. Mm-hmm. But I like people to raise money for me. So I like to do the work and have somebody else hustle the money. Mm-hmm. And Bateson did that, and Jackson did that, and mm-hmm. Sal was a great fundraiser. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And what are you most excited about now? What are you working on?
Well, I think running an institute and training people is exciting, and we're doing some interesting work. And I'm now getting more interested in taking psychotics and their families and treating them like we used to in the 50s and 60s, before medication wiped it out, to treat them like behavior problems. So I'm doing some of that. I'm keeping one or two going all the time now. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. I find myself doing more of what I've already done. So I would like to do something else, and I haven't got there. Mm-hmm. I tend to teach a more purist family therapy than is general. Mm-hmm. You know, one of the things some people may not realize is, it's hard to believe, the big contribution of family therapy to me in the 50s was, up to that point, everything was caused by the past. It was programmed by the past. If a person had a phobia, he had a past trauma that caused it, and so on. And the family therapy idea that came in was a new idea in the world, because people had always assumed the past caused the present. It was argued that symptoms had a present function, that if you describe the social network, you see how the symptom is appropriate adaptive behavior. And that was a new idea that I'm still playing with. But what I've been trying to work out is, I think there's, out of family therapy, which I was investigating partly because I think that was the best way to study human relationships, is when you intervene to change them, then you realize what they are. Mm-hmm. And that was the aspect of therapy that most interested me. Mm-hmm. And I think it will come out with some laws of human relationships, or some regularities that have never been known about. That there's some new contributions coming out of that I'm still trying to think through. Let's put it that way.
You use the term purist, and some of your critics have suggested that you've not kept up with the times in terms of the biological dimensions of schizophrenia. And how do you respond to that?
For schizophrenia? God, in early 1950s, we were promised a finding of the physiological cause of schizophrenia, and in the 60s, and in the 70s, and in the 80s, and now we're promised in the 90s, and they still don't have it. Even if they did, I don't think it matters as far as therapy goes. It doesn't mean that, therefore, you have to keep a person on medication and treated like a handicapped person. Mm-hmm. I mean, we all have something physiological that gets us in some way. But it's, if you think socially, you realize that putting a young person on medication defines them as sick. Then if you want the parents to get them to be more normal, the parents hesitate because they don't want to push a sick child. So by the very act of labeling them, you produce the problems you're trying to solve. And so we get them off medication, out of custody, and back to work or school, and as that happens and there's difficulties. Well, let me say something. You know, one of the things that I think happened with families in the 50s was everybody, a lot of people, including our project, were anti-parent. And we gave parents the parents were just discovered at that time. And we gave them a pretty hard time. And they had a lot of blame. And I think we're still paying for that. Mm-hmm. I think an organization like NAMI of 50,000 mothers and fathers who are anti-therapy for schizophrenics is a product of them being blamed. And it's a complicated problem, because if you have a family theory, you work with the family to get somebody over a psychosis. And if you do that, if the very act of bringing in the parents implies they have something to do with it. And no matter how you try to present the argument that they know the kid best and can help you get the kid out of whatever he's in, they still have a feeling that you're saying it's their fault. And not all families by any means, but many. And that's a problem we still suffer with, I think.
You see any way around that?
No.
We're stuck with that legacy.
I think so, yeah. We just go ahead and if the, you know what Bateson used to say was if the parents drove a kid crazy deliberately, then they deserve blame. And most of them don't know how to do that, so they didn't do it deliberately. But we work regularly with families who start by being so sensitive about blame, and then they give it up when they realize that the way you're working, you're not, that we don't know what drove somebody crazy. We know what to do with it after they're crazy, and how we can have the family solve that. But the question of who caused it, what caused it, I don't know.
So even if it was somehow scientifically demonstrated that schizophrenia is a brain disease, you would still treat the behavioral manifestations of it in the same way.
We treat families of mentally retarded kids and expand the limits of what they can do, and wouldn't subdue them with drugs.
That's a passionate issue for you, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's one of my main interests, really. I think families of schizophrenics, and schizophrenics are fascinating. I think they educate people. Schizophrenics were always used to educate psychiatric residents. They work with them in the hospitals, even though they were never going to work with them afterwards. They all go into private practice. But in the hospitals, they learned, and they learned on these fascinating people who are out of their minds. And now that they just drug them, I don't think the resident training is as good.
They don't talk to them.
Yeah, they don't talk to them, and they don't get touched personally by them. And I've trained residents for many years, and I think there's a much less sophisticated crowd of resident psychiatrists now. And most of them don't believe in therapy. You know, the therapy is now an elective in many psychiatric training programs.
With the ultimate goal in some places of a blood test for the diagnosis, so you never have to talk to the patient.
That's right. That would be ideal, yeah.
Not your ideal. Yeah. Some other areas of controversy that you've been involved with. You talked before about manipulation. I mean, that's been the sort of standard criticism of your work. And you've responded that all therapy involves manipulation, and it's a matter of whether you know you're doing it or not.
Sure.
That doesn't seem to have convinced the critics. What do you think that issue is all about? I mean, what perspective do you have on that?
Gee, I think there's so many reasons why people are uncomfortable with that. Some are uncomfortable with taking the responsibility for changing somebody. But others do it for other reasons. And some misunderstand it. For example, they think if you use a paradox, it has to be done out of somebody's awareness. But I used to have colleagues who would say, I have a symptom, would you do a paradox on me? And I would do it. And it works. It has nothing to do with their awareness of it. It has to do with going through a relationship process of being encouraged to do the same thing they came in to get over. And that has some strange effect on our classification system.
Well, do you make a distinction, I know you do in some of your writings about this, between being indirect and being lying or being deceptive?
Sure. I don't think you should lie to people, no. But I also don't think you should share the machinery of therapy with people. Therapy is for experts, not for families, I think. In this sense, I was just reading a New Zealand journal in which they were arguing that the mirror is undemocratic, and that the family should see the people behind the mirror, and the people behind the mirror should see the families, and they should all get together and know everything that's happening. And I don't agree with that. I think families come in to get over something from an expert, and if sharing what you're doing would interfere with the therapy, you shouldn't do it. I would rather have what the therapy strategy is planned separately from the family, and then use. It's a matter of taste to some extent.
One of the ironies, I think, about your career is that although you've been criticized on the ethics issue around this issue of manipulation, you've written more on ethics and earlier than practically anybody else in the field. In your 1976 book, You wrote about ethics. What ethical ideals do you think have most influenced your work?
Well, in that 76 book, what I was dealing with is fair exchange. I think if people pay their money to get over a problem, you should get them over the problem. And not take a position that was taken for a long time, that it's not your job to change somebody, it's your job to help them understand themselves. Then if they change or not is up to them. That kind of an attitude, I think, is borderline ethical. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Also, to not learn the skills that change people seems unethical to me. If you're in the business of therapy, you may or may not want to use them, but you should know how to change people if you need to.
Mm-hmm. The other area of controversy that I want to discuss is the gender issue and the feminist critique of family therapy. That's been around for a while now, and I'm sure you've thought about it. Mm-hmm. And what's your reaction?
Well, my reaction is that I have a lot of respect for women. Half my ancestors were women. And I think the feminist movement as a political movement is extraordinary and a necessary and helpful women to get women out of the position they've been in society for so long. I think the calling attention to the gender differences in the family has been valuable. One of the things I think feminists should do is do something about men if they're going to help each other, if they're going to help women. One of the things I've noticed recently, and it may not be true of everybody, but it seems to me the majority of couples who come in have a man who's lower in status than the wife who comes in with them. That is, the man is less articulate than the wife, or the man is less educated than the wife, or he shows less initiative than the wife, or he comes from not as good a family as she comes. But they come in unequal with the man down. And often the wife brings the man in saying, do something about this guy. And I think there's very little in the feminist literature about what do you do about a man who his wife would like him to be more improved. There's just those techniques for elevating a man in a couple, they haven't cataloged or dealt with or described. Mm-hmm. I just think that what women want in so many cases is something done about the man. Mm-hmm. And therefore, something should be done about techniques developed for that.
Mm-hmm. Has the feminist movement, inside or outside family therapy, directly influenced the way you think about therapy or the way you teach therapy, the way you theorize now?
I think it's probably made me, as well as everybody, more sensitive to gender differences and to the position of... Here's the complication for me. I think that women have been put down in society, obviously, in the history of women. In the family, that isn't necessarily so. That is, I think there's a dual hierarchy. There's a difference between the hierarchy that a woman is in within the family and when she's outside the family in the community. Outside in the community, she has difficulty making the same money as a man and so on. Within the family, she has a lot of power and authority, which you have to respect when you're dealing with the family. Yeah.
Of course, what feminists have said is that her authority within the family is diminished by her knowledge and her husband's knowledge that her access outside of the family is limited, so that there's the feedback loop.
Oh, I'm sure that's probably true.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How about the area of the whole area of individual psychology? You started out psychodynamically oriented and moved into a systems approach. How do you respond to people that say that there's at least an implicit theory of individual psychology in your work and in all systems work, that you're talking, say, to one person at a time, and you have to have a set of assumptions about how they operate?
Gee, I don't know. I would say whoever said that is in academia. I think there's a...
Does that mean bad? Is that a bad place to go? Just for the record, I just...
It's bad in the sense I think they're trying to defend past positions in a time of change. That ordinarily what happens is things change slowly and cumulatively over time in any field. And when that happens, academia is the source of knowledge. If you hit a discontinuous change, so whatever is happening now is different from what came before, academia has a real handicap because it's trying to conserve the best of the past. And one of the things I think is happening to family therapy is there's a lot of people trying to take away its unique nature in order to get along with people who have other theories, like individual theories and so on. There's a lot of compromise with family therapy is what I think. And to make it more acceptable. And I think it's too bad because I think it loses what was unique in its contribution.
And so you described yourself as a purist, and you're holding on to that kind of spirit.
Well, I think, God, I wouldn't want to speak for the other founders, whatever a founder is, but most of them are purists. When Mnuchin took over the Philadelphia Child Guidance Clinic, he got rid of groups. He got rid of play therapy, except when they had to pass their boards. Well, the child psychiatrists had to pass their boards to be child psychiatrists. He got rid of individual therapy. He said this is going to be a family-oriented place, and it's one of the few child treatment places in the country that was purist under his domain. Jackson was absolutely a purist in this sense that he gave up a couch where he'd been an analyst, resigned from the Analytic Association, started seeing families, and there was a group meeting. The group therapists heard about family therapy and wanted to keep up to date with it. So they asked for a meeting of family therapists, group therapists, and there was a meeting in San Francisco. And they invited Jackson to speak. And Jackson got up and said, group therapy has nothing to do with family therapy. That's a collection of individuals, whereas families, you're concerned with ongoing relationships and changing sequences. So group therapy has nothing to do with family therapy, and I don't think, what he said was, I don't think it's contributed anything new in the way of ideas, and I don't think it changes people. And then he sat out. And that's a pretty purist position.
That's a purist position. I think we've defined it. Well, perhaps the people who found movements almost have to be purists.
I think so, in order to make the distinction that this is different, right?
But you're not convinced that this is a time when a more eclectic approach, you're concerned with the diminishing of the real contributions of the field, a kind of selling out to pandering favor with DSM-3 and other kinds of approaches.
I think an eclectic approach is, it means you won't take a position, let's put it that way. Well, there's another distinction that related to the DSM-3. I think one of the contributions of family therapy was to define human problems as human problems and not psychopathology. As an example with Mnuchin, when he dealt with a family with an anorectic girl, and some residents said that they were collecting cases of anorexia nervosa and they'd like to have known about this case. Mnuchin said, this is not a case of anorexia nervosa, this is a girl who won't eat. Now that's the distinction between purist family therapy and traditional psychopathology. You don't categorize individuals, you categorize human dilemmas as they occur in life and as you're trying to resolve them in families.
You know, one thing I think students would be interested to know is what you were like as a therapist when you did therapy every day.
Brilliant.
Well, that's that. It's funny, Jay, all the founders answered the question that way. I don't know why.
Well, let me give you a little more factual situation. I was an extremely competent therapist with a good outcome, but I could see I would never be a master therapist like Milton Erickson. I didn't have the social skills, I didn't have the control of my movement, I didn't have the control of my voice. I think a good therapist, like a master, like Erickson, can say a sentence and emphasize 3 words in the sentence to say another sentence and communicate both those messages in order to get something indirectly to happen. I just wasn't up to that, really. So I decided I could probably be a master supervisor, where I can be behind a mirror and more objective, more distant, have time to think and not have people pulling at me in different directions while I'm trying to think of what to do and so on. So I feel better behind a mirror, and I went that way.
When was that transition? Was that the move to Philadelphia, or did you continue to do therapy in Philadelphia?
No, when I went to Philadelphia, I stopped it.
Okay.
Actually, I stopped it when I started serious family research. I found I couldn't look at a family without thinking how to change them, which is the way a therapist works. And I wanted to look at them just like a phenomenon. And it took me about 1.5 years after quitting therapy before I could look at a family without thinking this is what they need and that's what they need and so on.
So it made you a better observer because you were not, you didn't feel impelled to change them in some way. And then behind the mirror, you could start to observe the therapeutic process more, which is where, really where you started, wasn't it, in the early 50s?
Right. I've always been a researcher into this,
Yeah. And so one of your major areas of contribution has been in the area of supervision, the teaching of this. I know.
You know, one of the interesting things to me now is what's getting more and more evident is that there has to be a consistency between the way the family is treated and the way the trainees are treated. That if you do an insight therapy, you need to do an insight training. If you do a directive therapy, you do a directive training. And that the parallels are almost exact as I work them out more clearly.
Well, and that's become a cornerstone of supervision in family therapy, isomorphism, to use the jargon phrase.
Sure.
One of the questions that I ask everybody, that's...
Before you ask that, let me say where I think the one-way mirror came from while we're on history. We were seeing families and recording them with audio. Film was so expensive. And we would then later play the audio tape of the session, listen to it. I heard about a guy, we were in Menlo Park at the VA, I heard about a guy who was seeing families, and we didn't know anybody else who was. Over in Alameda County, there was a juvenile hall, and a guy named Charles Fulweiler worked there. And he had set up a testing, he was a psychologist, and he was teaching psychologists how to test. So he had a one-way mirror where he would watch them test a kid, and he could then later correct it. He brought a family into that situation and watched them, and got interested in changing the family. It was when he started family therapy. And he would go behind the mirror, then he would walk in the room, say something to them, make a suggestion, walk back out behind the mirror. So he spent most of his time behind the mirror. So when I heard about him, I went over and I watched a whole series of sessions with him and realized how valuable this was, that you could watch a therapist actually doing it at this time. And so I went back, and the Bateson Project put in a one-way mirror. Then we began to get a lot of visitors who passed through, and they all assume that the way you do family therapy is a one-way mirror. And they began to put in one-way mirrors. And it all started with this guy who happened to bring a family in one day.
It's like Freud happened to have a couch.
That's right.
There's nowhere else to sit, so...
That's right. That could be it.
Yeah, I had a supervisor in graduate school who used to write on newsprint paper instead of the blackboard. We found out he was allergic to chalk, and the rest of us all thought you had to write on the newsprint. So that's how these things...
Everybody does it for their own purposes, right?
Right.
And actually, this man Fulweiler, one of the reasons he stays out of the room is he lectures families, is what he told me. If he stays in the room, he's busy lecturing. But he protects the family by getting out of there where he can't lecture them, and he watches them.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that part of what the one-way mirror did to family therapy was open it up to observation. And that continues to this day.
Sure.
It's a very public kind of therapy.
That's right.
And you were doing it, and were you the first ones to do that you know of?
To do which?
To have the one-way mirror and the observation of therapy?
Except for this guy.
Except for that one guy, yeah.
I mean, that's where we got it from, and then we did it. Although we had an interesting problem. Therapy was confidential in those days. Therefore, you didn't intrude on it. Well, this was the ideology. So we would put in a one-way mirror, and that did away with confidentiality in the sense you could watch the session. But it didn't occur to us you could knock on the door and call them out and talk to them, because that would interfere with the session.
Right.
And therefore, we would stand behind the mirror and watch a therapist in training fall on his nose with the family, and then we would tell him afterwards he shouldn't have done that. And it was a big step to use a telephone and call them and make a suggestion. You know, it seems an obvious step, but again, that took a long time.
Okay, well, the final question that I ask everyone is about how you see your legacy, or would like to see your legacy to future generations of family therapists.
A legacy?
Yeah.
You mean what I'd like to be remembered for?
Yeah. He's always reframing.
I want to be remembered as the oldest living teacher of therapy. Shall we have a question?
So in other words, you plan to be with us for a while and to keep contributing and keep teaching.
I think so.
Yes, and there's nothing we would like more.
Okay. Thank you.
It's time for the audience to get involved. You can line up at the microphones, and I'd like you to ask some brief, focused questions. There'll be monitors at the mics to orient you to who goes first and who goes second.
Mr. Haley, in couples therapy, can triangulation serve a positive purpose?
Absolutely. We teach a couples therapy based on forming coalitions. That is, one of the interesting problems with couples, if you get a couple who come in that are unequal, that is, one is more in charge and one is down with symptoms or whatever it might be, if you're fair to them, you're confirming that arrangement. You really have to not just be equal with each person. You've got to side with one against the other, I think. So we do that deliberately, sure.
When I, as a student, I first read your name, it was in relations to drug abuse, and it was talking about how mom and dad had focused on the child who had this addiction, and in describing the triangle, it came across as a monster, and it seems like in most instances it always, the triangulation almost seems like a monster, and so that's why I asked.
A triangle seems like a monster?
You know, in that situation where, as I understood the article, it was the child or maybe even an adolescent who took on the addiction as a means of bringing mom and dad together, focused on this child so that they didn't have to look at their own problems.
I think that children do that deliberately to help their parents, yeah, to give them something so they don't have to deal with other problems they can't deal with. Yeah.
Deliberately, consciously, or subconsciously, or unconsciously?
Or outside of awareness?
I mean, really deliberately?
I think with many of them it's absolutely conscious. That's
No kidding.
I don't think it's relevant whether it's conscious or unconscious.
I suppose
That is, we have a theory that the problem is people protect each other. And young people sacrifice themselves to help their parents in a situation like that, I would assume. As the parents begin to go unstable, the kid will shoot up. And then they pull together to deal with them. Their son is an addict again, and around they'll go.
Thank you.
Next question, please.
I'm wondering what your thoughts are on home-based therapy as a means of preventing out-of-home placement.
As a means of preventing which?
Out-of-home placement.
Oh, I'm all for a home-based therapy. Yeah. It's, I think it's an interesting and valuable one, particularly when you're dealing with a lot of people who won't come into the office. But it's also, it's an interesting therapy in the sense that you have new problems, whether to sit in father's chair or not. It also is easier on many families because they can get up and go make a cup of coffee, or get up and go to the bathroom, or leave and do something and come back when you're working in the home. In the office, they're trapped. And they can't get out really very easily without making a big deal of it. And most families have never sat down in a room and talked about their problems for an hour. I mean, it's really quite a thing to do. And I just think it's easier on them at home often. One of the interesting supervision problems is how do you supervise in the home? And you can do it with video or audio and look at it later, but current live supervision is awkward. And one of the things we used to do is have a supervisor go sit in the corner and be introduced as a consultant who might be made use of, might not. And then he sits there while the therapist deals with the family. And if the supervisor is needed, he gets into it. If he's not needed, he stays out of it. But he's available. Or she.
Next, please.
I was wondering about your statements about the democracy of family therapy and keeping expertise with the experts. And I wondered how you felt about the use of reflecting team.
I'm not an enthusiast for it.
Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, tell me more about how you would do it.
Well, I guess the theory would be that there'd be a team that's sitting behind a one-way mirror and watching as the therapy goes on with a therapist in the room, and then coming in and sharing their observations and their thoughts with the family. Almost as though the family's not there, but with the family as obvious observers of their thinking process, their strategizing.
Well, there are those who have the team sit in the room, and there are those who have them sit out of the room, and some sit out of the room part of the time. I'm for leaving them out of it and let the therapist handle the problem. We have sent in, I guess you could call it a reflecting team. I remember one case we sent in 12 therapists to persuade a guy he should do something. And all of them agreed he should do it, and that's a tremendous weight, you know.
Did he do it?
He did it, that's right.
He did it, okay.
But I think if you send in the team for a specific purpose like that, it's different than just to help the family become aware of what you've seen.
So you're saying use it strategically?
And what?
Strategically?
I think if you can make use of them strategically, it's better, yeah. The therapy I teach is not an awareness therapy. So we don't educate families particularly about their problem, unless they're a family that wants to be educated. But we don't share what we see necessarily with the family.
Thank you.
Next, please.
Yes, I'm wondering if you, in your journey toward older years, I don't mean that as an insult, but if your definition of spirituality, and I know there's a lot of emphasis in the recovery movement on spirituality, and if you see that has any role in strategic family therapy.
Well, it depends on what's meant by spirituality.
Maybe if you could define that in your own terms, what you see.
To me, it's a foggy concept. And doesn't really arouse my enthusiasm. If it helps somebody feel there's a higher power that stops them drinking, then I think that's fine. If it's that sort of spirituality. Because I think it's good if they stop drinking, if that's a problem.
Thank you.
Next, please.
I'm interested in hearing what you would have to say about the move to certify or license family therapists, and if you approve of that, how you think it would be best done.
Certify them by the state, you mean, and that sort of thing?
Yes.
Some years ago when in California, the Association of Marriage Counseling, or whatever it was in those days, was trying to get a license passed to be certified. And I made a nice talk that they shouldn't. That mainly because the certification implies to the public that the person is competent because they're licensed. And the licensing never requires a measure of competency. It requires a measure of how long you went to school. And therefore, I think it's a deception, really. you always take the risk that people aren't certified, that there's incompetent people out there calling themselves marriage therapists or whatever. But you have to be pretty sure that the licensing is based on competence, or you're sending out incompetent people out anyhow. So I don't think licensing protects people, let's put it that way. It's a union, really.
Thank you.
Next question.
Joe, you had the luxury of, earlier in your career, of spending a lot of time talking and thinking. And most of us don't find that luxury presently because we are in a more hectic phase of, at least I am. And I can't help but imagine that there were several areas related to family therapy that were touched on or thought of but never picked up on. Not that they were ignored, they just weren't important at the time. And as I look forward in the next 10 years or so, what I wonder is, what are we ignoring now that may have been paid attention to in the past but has been forgotten? Or what is it that wasn't even thought of yet that are major areas that you feel are being ignored and need to be addressed in the field? You've already mentioned several of them, but I'm looking for things that you haven't really talked about.
Gee, I have to put some thought on that. I don't know. I'm not sure it's to the point of your comment or question, but I think therapy, that there have been some successful therapy techniques developed and procedures developed which have had no influence whatever on the field. I think people change what they're doing on the basis of fashion or something like that, not on results. Like I think Mnuchin's procedure of having parents require an anorectic to eat was very successful. I've used it myself a number of times. But I think if a little anorectic walked into a hospital around here tomorrow, they'd start talking to her about her perception of herself, and they would go on doing what they've always done. I think there's been a very successful outcome with addicts by treating them with family therapy. But the average place treating addicts today doesn't use family therapy. They put it in their brochure they use it, but actually they put them in groups. And the systematic use of family therapy with addicts just isn't done, even though the outcome that Duke Stanton reported was really quite extraordinary. So anyhow, I think there are procedures that people develop, and unless they happen to be public relations people in some way or get to big meetings, it doesn't get into a form where it's fashionable, and therefore people don't do it. But I'm sure there's many techniques that have come up over the years that were effective that, well, it depends on how you think. We tend, in my approach anyhow, to focus the idea that you need a unique solution for each case. It's one of the reasons it's more difficult training in this, that you can't use a method for everybody, a method with everybody with a problem. Therefore, there's a lot of unique solutions which could be repeated with other cases, but which drop by the wayside by strategic therapists, I think.
Is there anyone in the back at the microphone?
Mr.
Yes.
Haley,
Yeah.
much of your work, the emphasis is on change, and I'm wondering about whether you ever, for yourself or for your clients, consider the concept of healing and what that would mean, and whether that is the same as change or different from change.
I would think of it as healing as change.
You would see them as the same.
As a change, yeah. It's a change from worse to better, at any rate.
Okay, next.
Mr. Haley, one idea that I think you communicated that I was struck by is that implicit in human relationships is the need to define the nature of the relationship. Could you expand on where you got that idea, and if you still hold it, how you employ it?
I still hold it, certainly. I think I got it from schizophrenics who don't do it. They're so skillful at not defining a relationship with you that it makes you realize that other people do define a relationship. Like some people, you can tell what to do and they'll do it or they'll refuse. a schizophrenic will manage to get interested in something else altogether, so you don't know whether he is or not. He just won't relate to you in the way you organize it. And so I think in studying the ways they do that, I got interested in how other people do it.
Thank you.
Schizophrenics are great educators, if they're not drugged. They really teach you a lot. They're the most interesting kind of psychological phenomena, I think. Partly because they're so innovative.
Next, please.
In the beginning of your presentation, I heard you say that two things which significantly influenced your therapy were Zen and Erickson.
Mm-hmm.
Would you care to comment on Zen and how that was influential in your practice of therapy?
Sure. Zen is a procedure that's 900 years old, where one person is changing another person. So they're experienced people, and they have their ways of doing it. What interested me about it is they aren't interested in the past at all. They never explore or have any interest in the past. And Erickson doesn't really explore the past. They use interventions which are specific, sudden interventions to change somebody. And Erickson liked to do that. It isn't a cumulative, slow change. They don't assume that if you become aware of why you do what you do, you'll change. And Erickson did. They tend to help enlighten you or change you, not by a conversation, but by some activities you do together. Like they teach Zen with swordsmanship, or with the tea ceremony, or with painting. The kind of therapy I learned from Erickson is that you change a person by giving them a directive. And then the therapy is around the way they do that directive and how it occurs and so on, which to me is very similar to a Zen procedure. There's a variety of examples like that have impressed me and influenced the way I've developed therapy over the years. I've just never written about it particularly.
Next, please.
Mr. Haley, in the field of child and family development, there has been some research literature on measuring therapeutic outcome based on the modality of therapy used. And they described an effect called the dodo effect. Have you heard of that?
No, I haven't heard of that. That sounds good.
It's called dodoism, and basically what it means is they have found that it doesn't matter what your mode of therapy is, that the therapeutic outcome is basically the same and is fairly dependent upon the relationship between therapist and client, whether you're a behaviorist or a structural strategic worker or experiential. And I'd be interested in you commenting on the dodo effect.
I would like to see that study replicated a few times. I don't believe it, that all the therapists do well depending upon the therapist, not on his procedures. That is, if you have a therapist who devotes himself to saying, tell me more about that, I don't think he's going to be as successful as somebody who intervenes and makes something happen in the person's life. It's something that should be further investigated. I think there is, as people get older as therapists, I think they develop more interpersonal skills in joining people. And I think change does occur as they join. And more experienced people do that better, I think. But certainly the ways they work had better affect the outcome, or we're all wasting our time in our training.
Is a piggyback question allowed?
Sure. Real quick one.
Okay, with that in mind, and I certainly agree with you about that, I question that stuff myself, but I would like to know, based on all of the therapies that are available to us in the field, what therapy do you think is most effective in dealing with family violence?
The one I teach.
I thought so.
Hi. Could you comment, Mr. Haley, about the place that Nat Ackerman filled in the East Coast in terms of the historical perspective and Nat Ackerman's role on the East Coast, and were he and Don Jackson communicating? Was there something systemically happening in the United States at that time that they were both developing?
Well, it was just that there was only a couple of institutes in the United States. Well, there was one developing down in Texas we could have used. But Ackerman, I think in many ways Ackerman was a tragic figure. That he was struggling with the analysts in New York and took an awful beating from them. And while he was battling with them, the rest of the country took up family therapy without that kind of opposition and difficulty. So that he would then feel that people should be following him, and other people would feel they'd gone past that. And I think that always puzzled him, because he thought he was in the center of things in New York, and New York was not the center of the development of therapy at that time. I remember, as an example, Ackerman said to Don Jackson, "Why don't you ever call me the father of family therapy?" And Jackson said, "I never thought of you as the father of family therapy."
Next, please.
In studying to become a family therapist, so much emphasis has been placed on systems, and the other disciplines are played down, including behaviorist, and yet there seems to be kind of an uprising of behaviorism in family therapy. And when Bill asked you about, well, what's ahead for you, you said, well, I'm interested in studying behaviors. Will we be seeing more done with behaviorism and treating families in the future?
Gee, I'm not a prophet in that sense, but the distinction I would make is this, that I think systems theory is an interesting theory for explaining why people are the way they are. It's not a good theory for innovating techniques to change people. For one thing, it's a theory of stability, of how systems correct themselves so they don't change. And I think you have to be more linear and intervene to make something happen. And I think the behaviorist techniques to do that sort of thing are probably very useful. Behaviorism isn't in fashion as much as it was, but I think it made a lot of contribution, including formulating problems so that operations could be thought of to deal with them. That is, instead of calling a kid a school phobia, which nobody knows what to do with, they would call it a school avoidance. And immediately you know what to do, to get the kid to stop avoiding school. And phrasing problems in that way has been a great contribution of the behaviorists, I think.
Okay, next, please.
Could you speak to the effectiveness in your ideas about co-therapy, either two therapists of the same sex or different, and what you think about it?
I don't think much of co-therapy myself. I think it costs twice as much, and from what I've seen, it isn't any more or as effective. But for training, I don't think it's a good idea, because the student tends to sit back while the teacher does most of the work. And I think ultimately the student's going to have to get in there and do the job, and I think if you put them in and stay behind the one-way mirror to help them when they need it, they take responsibility and learn faster because they're faced with having to do something and without somebody else doing it with them. Another thing is, if you do a directive therapy with a co-therapist, you can't just when you get an impulse to give a directive, you can't just give it, you have to clear it with the co-therapist. So it slows up the process, and you either have to discuss it in front of the family or go out and discuss it. I just think it's more effective to use one therapist.
Thank you.
Mr. Haley, could you share with us some of your past research ideas or current research ideas that you haven't been able to address?
Yeah, there's a lot of those. The best past idea I had, I never could carry out. I think we need an outcome study for family therapy that measures changes in relationships, not opinions about whether they've changed by asking people, But I think, for example, if you see a sequence like the kid does something wrong in the room, father says don't do that. Mother says don't pick on the kid. Father says he shouldn't do that. The kid a few minutes later does something wrong in the room. Father says don't do that. Mother says don't pick on the kid. Father says he shouldn't do that. And that sequence keeps repeating. It would be nice to have an experiment that would measure that sequence, that the way they play a game, or the way they press buttons, or the way they do some task together brings out that sequence. And then after therapy, you put them in the same situation and see if that sequence is no longer being done. But I don't think there would be too many experiments required once you got the hang of how to do this. But it's a difficult task, which I spent 2 years with one of the best experimentalists around as a consultant, and we ended up with 2 useful experiments. So it's a very difficult task. But I think that would be the kind of outcome research that family therapy should contribute, instead of just asking people if they feel better and they're over their symptoms.
Next, please.
Of the people that you've trained and worked with and who have published or written in the area, whose work have you read and really learned from or enjoyed?
Of people that I've trained?
Yes.
Gee, I never thought of that. I'd have to think about the people I've trained that wrote books. I have to pass on that for the moment. I can think of the people I've trained who wrote articles that I learned from.
Well, try those.
Well, okay, fine.
Well, there's one, Judy Matza, that I trained and who became a supervisor, developed a simple thing that was very effective and wrote a paper about it. And I learned from her. What she did was take an adolescent who's on marijuana but wants to kick it and isn't kicking it, and his parents want him to kick it and give it up. So she has the young man list all his friends in the family session. And he lists a lot of friends because he was popular. And then she asked the parents to sit down with him that night at the telephone and have him call each friend and tell him he's giving up pot. And he would appreciate their help in doing this. And that's a powerful thing to do if you do it with the kid, because once he's said to 18 kids, I'm giving up pot, the next day if he starts to smoke pot, he feels like an idiot. But it's a way to use a peer group in a very powerful way, I thought. And she innovated that and wrote it up, and I learned from it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Is there anybody at the mic in the back?
Yes.
Okay.
Mr. Haley, I think one of the things that most impacted me when I first began to read some of your writings was the concept of the therapist taking charge of the case management. And I remember the first time I read about you talking about a therapist firing a psychiatrist scared me to death to consider the thought. But most of us today who still live and work in the trenches and have to work in the milieus where we're dependent on people like psychiatrists and people who approve third-party payments and things like that. What is your ideas about the importance of case management when you have to work out in the real world in the trenches?
You mean in how to collaborate with psychiatrists, you mean?
Just get along with them, be the way I'd like to think about it. But
cooperate's a big word, I guess. You know?
Well, obviously, if you're the concept of taking charge, if I understood it, is that you need to be the case manager as a therapist, including the concept of firing a psychiatrist if he wasn't fitting the system. And how do you deal with that in the practicalities of those of us who live out in the real world?
Well, most of us live out there. But if I understand what you're thinking, we make a hierarchy because we think in terms of organizations. We make a hierarchy that's made up of experts and grandparents and parents and children. And we respect those levels. And I think when you go into a case, the first thing to find out is if there's another expert in the case that has more power than you do. And if so, you better negotiate or hand the case over to him. That is, I think it's silly to get into a case and then find out that somebody can medicate or lock the person up without your permission. And you have to be in charge. If you're going to, for example, with many problems, if you're going to empower parents, you have to be empowered yourself. you can't be empowered unless among the experts involved in the case, you're the one in charge, is the way I think of it. So I think you either arrange to take charge or you give the case to whoever else has more power. I think most of the time when you get a referral from a psychiatrist as somebody with more power, they have had enough of the case by that time anyhow. So they're willing to let you take it over if you just ask to take it over. You can negotiate these things. We do all the time out in the real world.
You mentioned that competence, that licensing doesn't mean competency. How would you suggest that therapists, lifelong maybe, be supervised?
I don't have a way to do it. I don't mean be supervised. I mean have some way of checking the outcome. So that, that is, there's therapists out there who've never changed anybody, and they're licensed. You know? And the next person who comes to them, they're not going to change. And nobody knows that. And nobody knows what they're doing because they're in a private consulting room. I mean, that's the way therapy has been done for years. And I think if you're going to license them and tell the public this person is a person you can go to, you should find some way to measure their ability to do well with at least a small series of clients. Or some kind of... It's an almost impossible situation because you're trying to measure what is very difficult to measure, and that's the most important issue of licensing. I don't think the number of hours you've talked to a supervisor or the number of courses you've taken really are relevant. They're helpful.
Well, I was concerned about another side of it, and that was the need of the therapist for a therapist, you know, to handle his own issues or her own issues.
Well, you know, one of the interesting things to me is I don't know of a single research project that shows that a therapist who's had therapy has a better outcome than one who hasn't. And there's millions of dollars on this because many places require a therapist to go into therapy. Some of them are now requiring a therapist's whole family to go into therapy. Or they can't get their degree. If the husband is applying for his degree, the wife and the kids have to come to therapy even if they don't have a problem and expose their families to a therapist because therapy, that's supposed to be helpful somehow. I mean, Freud had the idea that if you had a few months of analysis, it might help you be a little less biased when dealing with some people. That's now become a 7-year analysis in New York, training analysis in New York. And it's also led to family therapists naively just accepting this idea that therapy is going to help them do therapy. My own experience is that the more a therapist has had therapy, the more difficult it is for me to train them to be a therapist in at least my approach.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you'd care to comment on the contributions of the Milan tradition, Palazzoli and the others, who, as I understood it, saw themselves as taking off from both you and Mnuchin and MRI.
Sure. Well, everybody takes off from somebody. I think the Milan group is a very innovative, interesting group. I don't think of them as a strategic group particularly because they keep finding a method and wanting to hold to the method. And I don't agree with their neutral attempt to make the therapist a neutral person. But Madame Palazzoli has come up with a couple of techniques that I think are very powerful. That one of when you have a problem kid, sending the parents away for the weekend. Having the parents just leave a note saying, "We have gone away." And the kid wakes up the next morning and they're not there, and at dinner time they're not there, and the next morning they're not there. And I mean, you shake up a young person when you do that, and it's interesting. It begins to correct the hierarchy in the family pretty rapidly, which is not the way she thinks of it. Well, there's an interesting thing about her with me. She was telling me that hierarchy was not important. I was visiting one time, and that I was making too much of it. She said it's really not relevant to therapy. Then she walked in with the family, and the whole family stood up. Because she was the professor, and they stood up. That is, I think the Italians may live in such a world of hierarchy they can't see it, like a fish can't see the water. You know? Whereas in America, we're always struggling with who's in charge of what. But anyhow, I think there are Chiquin and Boscolo. I so enjoy. They're funny guys. I think it's an interesting group, and they're very popular in Europe because they make everything interesting. They tell interesting stories, and that circular questioning, I don't think is good for therapists, but it's an interesting one for bringing out what's happening in families, I think. It's just a non-hierarchical thing that makes it then difficult to make an intervention. But they do it so very well. Well, they do, and you get a real feeling, you know what this family's about after they do their interview.
We have time for one more question if someone has one.
Mr. Haley, I was told that you like to keep a couple of symptoms, I guess dysfunctional symptoms in your own life in order to keep you, quote, unearthed, okay, unquote. Is that true, and if so, has that been helpful?
You'll never know.
That's it, huh?
That's it.
Thank you very much. Let's